So we are no longer talking about investor in Mua or in Jurong. We're talking about pitching to the world because you have the so-called trade wars, you have the geopolitical tension. But over the last 40 years, any global company builds their operation around global supply chain. It's not as if that everything is manufactured in one country. Different parts come from all over the country. And COVID has shown that one disruption, you are dead.
Winning in martial arts and investments require the same skill. Both need preparation, flexibility, hard work, and sound judgment, which is no different from our philosophy at Grand Pine Capital. Because when preparation, action, and opportunities meet, it creates the perfect formula for success. A formula to make your money work hard for you. We are Grand Pine Capital.
I leave the tax cuts to the Ministry of Finance. But there are things, right? We talk about costs, right? Of course, we talk about petrol, we talk about electricity, and so on, right? But sometimes I think businesses, I run my own business, so I relate and I understand to a lot of SMEs out there, There is also this group of so-called intangible indirect costs.
Okay.
Bureaucracy is a cost.
Definitely.
If you actually have to wait for 7 months just to get something, time is money and these are costs, So we have a lot of bureaucracy. So what we try to do as a government is that we map out all these things. And when I say that it has to be equitable, it's like whatever that we think has to happen on one element, we need to be able to help the businesses in other elements so that it cut costs in other groups. Bureaucracy is one big example that if we can make things more efficient, if we can reduce the complexity of regulation, and it will allow for businesses to run faster and low cost. And some of these are happening. I think this month, Companies Commission, Suruhanjaya Syarikat has announced new audit threshold for companies. I think below 500,000 ringgit, no longer audit is no longer required, and then so that used to be quite a significant business cost, because if you're just starting, it's like fresh university graduate starting, and you want to do your startup or your small cafe, even from the day one, from the very beginning, you have to set aside at least 10,000 a year for the simplest audit and company secretary. That comes to about 800 ringgit per month, 800 ringgit per month is easily the utility bill. So if we are able to do these bits and pieces, I feel that eventually the net effect to the business is still a positive one.
Well, we're definitely happy to see this kind of policy having more coming up,
Okay, so now
you say don't get my tips about which stock will go up. I don't know.
We will figure out.
You'll figure out from this.
Because the coming part, we still need to talk about Johor Singapore economy.
That's an important topic.
Yes, because we were talking about the industrial point, which sector, but now maybe geographical point, southern part, northern part, or KL Selangor. So which part you will see will be the main driver to push our economy in the coming years?
So if you look at,
we don't know much about Johor. The detail, I think my followers, they are digging out which company will get benefit.
If you look at the spread of economic activities across the country, we have clusters of growth engine all over the country at different stage of maturity. So in the north is driven out of Penang. The spillover is all the way to south of Kedah. And then in the next few years, with the Korean integrated green industrial park, that spillover will also go to the north of Perak. So this is a cluster that is already ongoing, right? And it's a cluster that is built on semiconductors, is built on manufacturing. And when government plans, it's not as if that we can start everything from scratch. It's more like to add oil to an engine that is already running. Likewise, if you look at KL, Klang Valley, and it goes all the way down to even Seremban, right? This is where there is the bulk of the consumer power in the country is here. The bulk of service sector is here. The bulk of education institutions are here. So one would have, it's only natural that the growth will be driven by the service sector, by the high-end, more innovation-driven sectors in this area. Then we look at East Coast first. We have two clusters of heavy industries. For the time being, mainly driven by the oil and gas. But in Kuantan, we also have heavy industries like steel. One in Kerteh and one in Gebeng. That's actually quite a big corridor with hundreds of billions invested over the last 50 years for infrastructure and everything. And the very large heavy industry, petrochemical, oil and gas there, right? When the government plans for carbon capture in the future, one potential site is offshore of East Coast. And this will add more value to the attraction for heavy industries to go there. And then, of course, the Johor Singapore economic zone. Of course, you have Sarawak with a lot of its natural resources, and it makes them perfect for energy transition because of the hydropower and so on. They also have oil and gas, petrochemical, and so on. Now, let's come back to JS-SEZ, right? So before I go into that, right, to answer your question about which part and so on, when we plan, we look at the whole country. It's just I don't believe in coming up with infrastructure projects to push the local economy for that particular state or that particular place. We need to play by our strength. And we already have these clusters of strength all over the place. What we need to do as a government, if there is a need for the next round of infrastructure investment, we must be able to fortify and upgrade the infrastructure for the next wave of growth based on the existing strength. And then when we design a policy support for a particular industry, we must take into account the brownfields, because it's a lot easier to accelerate growth for brownfield project than starting from scratch on greenfield project. Right? So it's on that perspective that we look at JS-SEZ. Johor already have vibrant manufacturing base. They might be small in the last 30, 50 years in Muar, in Batu Pahat, in Pasir Gudang, in some parts of JB, even before all this, right? You have ST Electronics in Muar, which is a very large semiconductor and chip company. And then you look at the infrastructure there. Iskandar as a region already have a metropolitan, some parts of it already have metropolitan level infrastructure. But the problem is that it might not be so connected and seamless, because a lot of the investments and money is actually in Singapore, because Singapore is a financial center of the world. Anyone who wants to invest in ASEAN, usually they might go to Singapore first and then structure their investments into ASEAN countries, right? So that's why it's if we are able to take advantage of all these traits that already exist. The fact that Johor is already a manufacturing base, the fact that Singapore is already a financial center, and then transpose it, wear a cap, and ask yourself, if I am a global investor, what is the ideal situation for me? If I run a company from Tokyo, I would want to have the flexibility of operating in both Singapore and Johor as one seamless operation, because I can tap into the sophistication of Singapore in terms of financial services, in terms of their high value and highly trained manpower. Yet I also want the flexibility of resources offered by Johor. In the past, that couldn't be done because we are two separate countries.
Yeah.
And then even though we are only separated by about 1 kilometer of causeway, people actually have to queue, and then, because I have my laws, you have your laws, we have a lot of rooms for us to harmonize everything in order to move that area progressively to function almost like an economic unit.
Okay.
And this is not so much about infrastructure or policy. It's just basically physical things like, how do we tap our passport? How do we go through? It's about connectivity and so on. So providing that and making assurance that both Singapore and Malaysia's government will work towards that, unlock the most common sense view that prevails around the world, that this is basically a very good area, and if I want to invest, I would go to it, provided you do 1, 2, 3, 4. And JS-SEZ is all about managing that constraints of people's movement, is about harmonization, is about movement of goods. And then I think if we are able to do that, we will be able to attract global investments into that area.
Can I ask why last time the Iskandar territory, why the previous government couldn't attract Singapore, but this time we can?
It's only connectivity. Other than that, what actually they ask for the investor?
No, I feel that when we developed Iskandar, it was very much Malaysian vision for Iskandar, and Singapore then play a supportive role. That's why Iskandar didn't have any agreement. There was, it was not a national commitment of both. And once it's basically a Malaysian's vision, so we basically focus on our side, and therefore we could only resolve, obvious things like infrastructure, putting more roads, building more hotels, and so on. We couldn't resolve the bottlenecks, all that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that I mentioned just now, because that requires Singapore to work with us in order to harmonize and streamline. So we can say that please come here, but the Singaporean will say, I do want, but I don't want to get stuck in about 2 hours. And if I run, and if an international company wants to come to Iskandar before and say, does it make sense that I have 2 operations that is only about 10 kilometers apart? I can actually see from Singapore my facility there, but it's completely 2 different countries. That means I have to run 2 sets of books and everything. It's just the cost and the inefficiency outweighs everything else. That's why managing this require both countries to make a commitment that we will resolve so that everything becomes more efficient. That's the very concept of JS-SEZ that didn't exist before, because Iskandar was pretty much our plan, with Singapore supporting it, but all the key things were not necessarily on the table to be discussed.
Okay. Is that the only critical part that to make a win-win deal with Singapore, that is only connectivity that you say? Other than what critical part they are asking for?
Green energy.
Energy is important. That's why you see, let's go back to me. It boils down to the timing, doing the right thing at the right time, right? the timing is as such that the geopolitical tensions creates this vacuum where global investments have to hedge their operations in the global supply chain. So we are no longer talking about investor in Mua or in Jurong. We're talking about pitching to the world because you have the so-called trade wars, you have the geopolitical tension. But over the last 40 years, any global company builds their operation around global supply chain. It's not as if that everything is manufactured in one country. Different parts come from all over the country. And COVID has shown that one disruption, you are dead. Even though it's a small bolt from Mua, your final product in the US cannot go out.
It happened.
Yeah, it had happened during COVID, So there's a lot of rethinking. That means that there is an opportunity for a lot of new wave of investments. They need to find a place. And therefore the timing is right. And we can pitch JS-SEZ from that global perspective. That's number one. Number two, I think that's why NETR was important, whatever people say, because energy is important. And then as an economy, if we don't acknowledge that energy policy and energy reform is central to our economic planning, we just don't talk the same language with the rest of the world. When the rest of the world understands the impact of climate change on energy security and sustainability, before this, without an ETR, it is as if that we live in our own cave. It's like we just tell people, yeah, we'll think about it. But, the rest of the world want to see how are you going to do this? Because we like you, but, we have concerns about your energy transition. So putting an ETR first at the time when there is already global interest about hedging against the trade wars and makes JS-SEZ attractive, that just basically complete the puzzle. And of course, the political stability in the country. And I think there's also the way that we like to project Malaysia to the world, that we are very open, very confident, even though we are small. But we know that with the right ambition and the right work, we can have, a very respectable place in the world's economy. These kind of things sort of put everything together. And if I were a Singapore government, right, this whole thing about JS-SEZ has been a common sense forever, not just now. But having that a little bit confidence that the Malaysian counterpart really believe in this as well, that I think sort of allow us to progress JS-SEZ the way that it has in the last 2 years.
It's very different perspective to the last time. Yeah. So since many clusters have a very good dynamic, should we expect 6% GDP growth is not far?
Or higher?
I don't go through the detailed economic growth modeling at this ministry or the Bank Negara and so on. And you've met a lot of businessmen, right? If you met businessmen, a lot of businessmen are basically the back of the envelope guy. Yeah, we do a lot of numbers and so on and so on. But usually it's about there's a lot more than now. I don't know yet what is the threshold. But if we are able to diversify our bursa into those kind of companies, then I think it will be able to drive our growth beyond 6%. For the time being, my view is that we have some work to do in order to restructure our economy. That will take another 4 or 5 years, just to get everything set. It's almost like these are new projects. If you run a company, you have your revenue stream, you have existing revenue stream, but you need to work on new growth initiatives. As this growth initiatives begins to yield result, then you will be able to jump to the next level. For the time being, we are deep in our restructuring, and we have all this initiative. If it works, and especially the chips, everything, energy transition, our place as a global hub becomes better, then it will coincide just nicely with ASEAN becoming a major market. Then I think, one generation down the line, even a 6% growth target is doable.
then obviously the government need the second terms, I think.
Yeah, not so much because I don't really like my job, to be frank.
You like to be an accountant?
No, I mean it's a lot better running your own things because
Yeah,
you don't,
sure, yeah.
you just answer to your shareholders, which is myself, and then your board, which is appointed by you, and then your own company. I don't need money. I'm comfortable as it is. The freedom means that doing a public job like this actually really restrict your freedom. But if we were to have this chance of moving to the next level, this government does require a second term to see through some of these growth initiatives we discussed so that it does have a chance to realize its potential. It's not campaigning, right?
Yeah.
It's Chinese New Year, ma.
I
I didn't say it. I was asked that question.
No, we are expecting. Well, people are asking when will be the 6,600 indexes will break through and steady on top of that.
Yeah.
So I think we need the 6% GDP growth to see.
No, I think that that confidence level of 1,600, I think it's within reach, and I don't necessarily consider it as a confidence level. The next confidence level is basically 1,007. Of course, we have to see through this market correction. The last few weeks, there's a lot of reaction to Trump and now DeepSeek and so on and everything. But so long as it's trending upwards, and then the market will always recorrect itself. I'm hoping that 1,700 is actually doable for 2025.
Okay, this is a really good news from
good
all
news.
to all investors.
Yeah. So today we got a lot of answer we wanted.
We didn't eat a lot.
Yeah.
We should.
Yeah. we
Literally.
we can enjoy later. So maybe I wrap it up because YB still has a next
Before
meeting.
you wrap up, I have a last question into a more personal one. You see, we are actually a young entrepreneur, so we see you strive for the political movement for 20 years, more than 20 years, a lot challenging. Okay, and what drives you for the passion of that? Up to now, you have the success, or can I say success?
I didn't plan for this, I was like, I had a good life, and I didn't enter politics by design. It's just that when Dato Sri Anwar was sacked, I felt like it was a duty because I really disagree with the way things are.
Okay.
And then the rest was basically unplanned to the point that I got my back to the wall. Then I didn't have a choice. It's either I continue in politics or I go to jail, for example. It's like, so likewise, I've as good as retired after 2018. I was very happy to go and run startup and do small businesses here and there. And then, PKR had some trouble winning votes, 2021, 2022. And I had a lot of friends in the party who spent 20 years with me. I have the options, they don't. I have a company, I have a good life, they don't. And it's like, to turn them down is very selfish. So I was driven by the fact that I had no way out. Actually, it's good. It's the same way when you run a company, right? If you are complacent around it, it's not the same with people who have to do it because otherwise you go bankrupt. When you're back to the wall, you tend to be a lot more creative and you just push harder. It's not that much different from my own journey in politics.
Okay. Die or live.
Die or live. Die or live. Now or never. Type of things. Yeah.
Well, Mr. Lee, I have to say today we had a great time with YB, Rafizi, and I hope our audience will have a great time, same like what we did, because I learned a lot today, and there are some philosophy of how you manage this department, and even though the direction of our country's economy, actually you did share, and I think we take different diamonds from YB. So I hope our audience today can I think you need to watch, subscribe, and like, and watch this video for 2 or 3 times. And
Agree. I can do it 2 or 3 times to get you to subscribe more.
and you will see what is really happening in Malaysia and our economic direction. So thanks YB today.
Thank you so
thanks
much to
again
both
for
Thank
your
you,
time.
thank you, YB.
Yeah.
Okay, and happy Chinese New Year.
Yeah, every channel.
Go see Fa Chai.
Go and see Fa Chai.
Yeah, and we can.
We will eat this, don't worry.
Thanks for watching. Bye bye.